Hello, I'm Megan Roshak, and I'm a senior at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay studying communication. I am presenting my research on the comic book character Tank Girl. My goal with this research was to understand what influences created this character and what she truly represents in our popular culture. I will be summarizing my research as well as sharing some key takeaways in this video. My research was originally packaged in a 7-part web series, so each episode was about 10 minutes. I scripted, filmed, edited all of them just by myself. So through this study, I was able to really learn a lot about not only feminist media theory, but also the technicalities of production. This video presentation will be broken up into a few different parts, just like the web series was. First, I will explain who Tank Girl is. Second, we can cover the history of the character. Third, we will discuss the bigger picture of women in comics. Following that, we will dive into the Tank Girl comics and the Tank Girl movie. And lastly, we will summarize our discussion by talking about feminist theory, pop culture, and Tank Girl. So first, you may be wondering, who is Tank Girl? Tank Girl was first a comic book character and still is. Her first appearance was in the British comic magazine Deadline in 1988. Two men, Jamie Hewlett and Alan Martin, created Tank Girl. Most sources describe the comic as vulgar, but most also admire the comic's attitude. In the comics, you get violence, booze, sexuality, humor, and a dash of anarchy, so really the whole package. Tank Girl is unapologetically herself as she leads adventures through post-apocalyptic Australia with her mutant kangaroo boyfriend and friends. As you can probably guess from the name, she drives a tank. Her stories don't necessarily follow a traditional format. The tales are usually bizarre, sometimes psychedelic, and you never really know what's going to happen next. In addition to the comics, there was a Tank Girl movie that came out in 1995. The original creators didn't love how the movie turned out, and it definitely wasn't a box office hit, but we can now recognize its cult following. No matter opinions or commercial success, both the comics and the movie really come together to develop the character that we know as Tank Girl. To even farther understand Tank Girl, we can look at the history of the time that she was created in. In the UK in 1988, Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister. She was a member of the British Conservative Party, and she took office in 1979. You may know Thatcher as the Iron Lady. People often refer to her as such because of her speech which condemned communism. You may also recognize the political ideology called Thatcherism. This is, of course, named after Margaret. It mixed free market ideas and family values, so while it was political, it was also personal. Thatcher made it clear that she believed families should be traditional. In fact, she solidified that with the controversial Section 28. The clause stated that local authority shall not promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. So this meant that same-sex relationships couldn't be discussed in class. According to one source, Section 28 marked a disturbing backward step for tolerance and inclusivity after the strides made by the British LGBT+ movement since the decriminalization of male homosexuality in 1967. In 2003, this was repealed, but it still had a huge impact. Something else we need to look at in regards to the year 1988 is the Riot Grrrl movement. Yes, it is actually spelled with 3 R's. Riot Girls made the decision to transform the word girl into more of a growl. The term Riot Grrrl is defiant while still acknowledging the transformative years of youth. The Riot Grrrl movement isn't one that just has one definition or meaning. Throughout the movement, members would continuously define and redefine Riot Grrrl while sticking to core beliefs of feminism. The Riot Grrrl movement was born out of the initial punk movement. In the late 1970s, the term punk first emerged into accepted terminology, and society began to define it by things like music taste and aesthetic. This initial punk movement of the late 1970s was one that disrupted traditional masculinity in the rock and roll tradition. Women were now part of the band and even played major roles. But by the late 1980s, toxic masculinity seemed to have crept back into style in the punk world. Women were pushed aside, many single women didn't feel safe going to shows due to the risk of assault, and it became a very unsafe space. But in the late 1980s, early 1990s, women started speaking out against the male punk appropriation. This movement aimed to reclaim the multi-gendered spaces from the 70s punk movements and became known as Riot Grrrl. The Riot Grrrl aesthetic can be demonstrated through music like that from Bikini Kill and other punk girl bands. The lyrics speak volumes, but also their dress and appearance. According to one media theorist, Riot Grrrl dress and aesthetic challenges male gaze. They turned being looked at into an aggressive act. The Riot Grrrl movement also included the diffusion of messages through handmade zines. The self-published magazines allowed self-expression and the ability to tell stories that had been taboo before. Girls could relate to others through zines by writing about coming out, surviving rape, surviving incest, and struggling with eating disorders. These are topics they may not have had an outlet to discuss before. The Riot Grrrl movement is also defined by its DIY attitude. These zines were cut and pasted together. The music was created and performed by girls in the community. Everyone followed the motto of do it yourself while still coming together to share their art. In about the late 1990s, the Riot Grrrl movement slowed down, the mainstream stepped in, and the subculture kind of absorbed into the popular culture. But the core ideas from Riot Grrrl still live on and still continue to inspire. I also believe we need to place 1988 in relation to the waves of feminism. In the mid-60s, you had the second wave as it is typically defined, and in the early 1990s, you had the third wave. In the second wave, the issues of the cultural and interpersonal dimensions of sexism were focused on. This included things like reproductive justice and working towards the elimination of cultural sexism. According to historian Linda Gordon, the second wave radically changed the terrain. In her words, it moved rocks, carved out new courses, and deposited new soil, producing new gender structures. The new riverbed was felt everywhere, in health, in reproductive choices, media and culture, employment, parenting, education, sex, man-woman, woman-woman, and parent-child relations. There was a lot of forward movement, even with the backlash. In the third wave, some issues of focus were workplace rights, working to eliminate rape culture and violence against women, resistance to objectification of women in media and pop culture, institutional equality, racial justice, and LGBTQ+ rights. You can see how some of the core issues tackled during the Riot Grrrl movement are loud and clear in the third wave. Rape culture, violence against women, objectification, and diverse spaces were all issues Riot Grrrl spoke out about in songs or zines. These were some of the core issues that all stick out during 1988. You can also see the rising activism for LGBTQ+ rights that had been limited under Margaret Thatcher in the UK. Of course, there are many other issues, but I point out those specifically to demonstrate their overlap. They are all interconnected, not only by timeline intersections, but by attitudes and beliefs. This was the time that Tank Girl was created in, and the effects show in her character and story. For example, I mentioned the quote that stated Riot Girls turned being looked at into an aggressive act. You can see this concept in action with Tank Girl comics. She is not just an object, she is in control. Her aesthetic is very punk and very Riot Grrrl. Also, when you look at how the panels lay out, it feels very zine-like. Comics are DIY in nature, but the connection of Tank Girl to Riot Grrrl goes farther than that. Her attitude and her speech also lead me to believe that she would have fit right in with the movement if she was a real person. Margaret Thatcher was another historical influence I thought it was worth mentioning in relation to Tank Girl. I believe the conservative social climate Thatcher's leadership created resulted in media that spoke out against it. Tank Girl didn't and couldn't vote against Thatcher, but her attitude put up a middle finger to traditional values and censorship. I mean, her boyfriend is a kangaroo, and her speech is anything but clean. Also, those involved with Tank Girl's publication had some great rebuttals to the anti-LGBTQ+ attitudes of the time. Deadline's publisher Tommy Astor was quoted talking about Tank Girl saying, "The boys love her, the girls love her. In London, there are even weekly lesbian gatherings called Tank Girl Nights." I even read on various forums that fans had anti-Section 28 Tank Girl merchandise that they wore to protests. Many viewed her and continue to view her as a figure for female empowerment as well. Over the history, it seems that she may have grew into a symbol for a greater cause than even her creators intended. Yet, her roots in 1988 and punk counterculture played a role in her aesthetic and how she was created. It is also helpful to review the history of women in comics to understand how Tank Girl fits in. In the Golden Age, the first female characters were printed. The most notable and recognizable woman character from that time is Wonder Woman. I am sure many of us know her, but for some background, Wonder Woman is a warrior princess from the Amazons. A man named William Marston created her. He expressed that there was a need for Wonder Woman because, in his words, not even girls want to be girls so long as our feminine archetype lacks force, strength, power. The obvious remedy is to create a feminine character with all the strength of Superman plus the allure of a good and beautiful woman. While there are some problems with his statement, he did acknowledge that there was a need for a powerful and strong woman in comics. A press release for the comic stated, Wonder Woman was conceived by Dr. Marston to set up a standard among children and people of strong, free, courageous womanhood, to combat the idea that women are inferior to men, and to inspire girls to self-confidence, achievement, in athletics, occupations, and professions monopolized by men. Wonder Woman was created specifically to be influential. In current day, we can see how that goal has been accomplished. She is viewed as a symbol of power for women. Generations of girls have looked up to her. Movies and other media established the relevancy she still has as a character in our popular culture. She showed that a female hero story could be successful and popular. The Silver and Bronze Ages of comics offered a more difficult playing field for women characters. The public became worried about the messages that comics were spreading. Parents worried about violence, sex, and even poor grammar. They didn't want their children reading stories that would negatively affect them. To combat concerns, the Comics Code Authority was formed in 1954 in the US, and they created a code for all comics to follow. Under this code, vampires and ghouls couldn't appear in comics, excessive use of slang was discouraged, criminals couldn't be glamorized, using the word crime was even discouraged, and the list goes on. They covered their bases when it came to almost all situations. They even had rules for how divorce should be depicted. The real kicker was the line that stated, females shall be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities. Please note that they did not say this about men. Men could still be drawn as ultra bulk and ultra powerful. Their physical qualities could be exaggerated. Saying that females shall be drawn realistically didn't really stop their characters from being objectified or submissive, it just censored their bodies. Also, in response to the Comic Code Authority rules, DC Comics created their own policy that stated, the inclusion of females in stories is specifically discouraged. Women, when used in plot structure, should be secondary importance and should be drawn realistically without exaggeration. Both codes, along with entirely male creative staffs, really discouraged any real portrayals of women in comics. They could be femme fatales or love interests or assist the main male character, but they were not as prominent. Once women characters played mostly background roles in comics, women readership started to drop off. In current day, these codes no longer exist, but the effect it had, I would argue, could still exist. If these codes were not in place, would we have more female characters? Would more women read comics? Would more women write comics? Who knows, but women were excluded from the comic space for a long time. This brings us to the modern age of comics. Around the 90s, women started speaking out about their exclusion and abuse in the comic scene. Female characters were not only background characters, but they were becoming punching bags in storylines. Gail Simone spoke out about this in 1999 with a list titled Women in Refrigerators. You can actually still see this project on her website. She started this list when, in her words, it occurred to me that it is not healthy to be a female character in comics. I'm curious to find out if this list seems somewhat disproportionate, and if so, what it means really. These are superheroines who have been either depowered, raped, or cut up and stuck in the refrigerator. I know I missed a bunch. Some have been revived, even improved, although the question remains as to why they were thrown in the wood chipper in the first place. This list was partially inspired by the Green Lantern comic number 54. Essentially, the hero finds his girlfriend chopped up in a fridge. Sure, in comics, everyone gets a bit roughed up, but the violence that women characters face is quite disturbing. Simone's list includes characters who were raped then killed, who were made infertile then killed, who contracted HIV and died, who were lobotomized, who had eyes removed, who were sexually assaulted, who were tortured, and who died because they, quote, went crazy or had multiple personality disorder and caused their own end. I do not believe it is far-fetched to say the abuse women in comics face is disproportionate to what men in comics face. There is also the issue of women being extremely sexualized in comics. Their gender is constructed by the way their bodies are drawn, the way they are dressed, and the way they are posed. Typically, women in comics have a feminine figure and fit in with traditional beauty standards. The way in which women's bodies are drawn in comics almost makes it seem like their sexiness is more important than the crime they are fighting. According to university professor Jeffrey Brown, modern female characters are so thoroughly eroticized that it's nearly impossible to find a superheroine or villainess that is not defined primarily by her sex appeal. To farther illustrate this, let's take a look at what it would look like if male characters were posed like female characters. Various artists have explored this idea. It seems so obscure to see these powerful heroes in such suggestive and sometimes demeaning poses, yet it is so common to see women's bodies being displayed in that way. Some have even become desensitized to it, viewing it as normal. Oftentimes, the female character becomes an object of heterosexual male desire. This is called male gaze. Yet, some criticize this concept and say that the male gaze is easily reversed because heterosexual women can read comics and see large, muscly, attractive guys. It is a myth that you can't criticize lady superheroes for being sexy because male superheroes are also sexy. I think author Sam Miggs refuted this idea best by saying, "In comics, over-sexualized female characters and testosterone-tastic male characters are both male fantasies. The women are male sexual fantasies and the men are male power fantasies, so criticizing the standards for both sexes is totally fair game. Either way, it's a yucky byproduct of the patriarchy. To be clear, everyone has a right to critique these problematic depictions. It's what actually leads to change, and in fact it has. In recent years, we've been getting a more diverse image of female main characters, yet there is still work to be done. According to a Ms. Magazine 2020 article, female characters make up around 30% of all comic book characters when you take into account the Marvel and DC universes. This includes all women characters. If we just looked at comics headlining women, that statistic would be lower. And the creative staff is still mostly male. I bring up the staff gender gap to illustrate the fact that talented female creatives deserve opportunities just like the talented male creatives do. As we discussed with the comic codes earlier, women were pushed aside in the comic space in many aspects. Of course, I still believe men can create stories that are engaging about female heroes. As you know, Grrrl was created by men. Their artistic influence and the influence of the time that she was created in molded her. Speaking of Grrrl's creators, that brings us to our discussion of the Grrrl comics. As I said, in 1988, Grrrl was born. Hewlett and Martin worked together on her story. Then in 1995, Grrrl made it to the big screen. After this, Hewlett went to work on other projects, and Martin continued the comic series with various guest artists. Grrrl the Odyssey and Grrrl Bad Wind Rising are a couple series from the post-film period. In 2014, Grrrl was even made kid-friendly for an appearance in Moose Kid Comics. Around 2015, Hewlett and Martin teamed back up with a few other artists to create the series 21st Century Grrrl. This has led to a few other series and stories, and more Grrrl comics are currently in the works. Throughout her different series, you can see very different artistic styles at play, yet there are many elements of her appearance that remain the same, like a mostly bald head, a mismatched style, and some bandages for accessories. As she has grown as a character over the years, she still has remained true to her roots. Fans of the series, of course, have their style preferences, but all of the panels come together to form one defined character. Something that is important to consider when analyzing Grrrl is her environment. She is drawn into the post-apocalypse. I believe this to be symbolic. One author stated, "I feel like there are many writers like me who see dystopia as a way of examining current events. I never feel like I'm writing about the future, I feel like I'm writing an altered view of the present." We see this idea in Grrrl with her strong connections to the counterculture of 1988. The comics throw traditional values and censorship out the window while hitting the printing press during Margaret Thatcher's conservative reign. Grrrl represented an opposition to the mainstream, and she continues to. This is shown in a number of ways. First, there is the depiction of violence in Grrrl comics. It is frequent and commonly hurts male characters more than female characters. Everyone gets bruised up, but men in Tank Girl comics literally get stomped on by women. When a man catcalls, he gets shot. But violence in Tank Girl seems to be a rage against oppressive forces rather than oppressive violence towards men. The violence in Tank Girl comics plays in a taboo area. It is stereotypically taboo for women to be driving a tank and shooting at people. We aren't used to seeing that, even in comics. It goes against gender stereotypes for women to be more militaristic. Her attitude and language also prove her as a force to be reckoned with. She is clever and assertive with some explicit vocabulary mixed in. She has no problem standing up for others and for what she believes in. We also have to address her unique appearance. She takes on an aesthetic and style that is more in line with the punk counterculture than with the mainstream. Traditional standards of beauty don't seem to be as present in Tank Girl's world. I believe this could be a byproduct of her setting. In a strange and new post-apocalyptic world, who and what influences style? When a former world falls apart, where do standards go? It is also interesting to note that Tank Girl comics do not shy away from the grotesque body. Bodily fluids are sometimes even the main focus of a story. We discussed how Riot Girls turned being looked at into an aggressive act. Tank Girl does this throughout the comics in various ways. For example, Tank Girl's nudity is used in a way that is defiant rather than submissive. Nudity is also used in a way that challenges norms. If a man can be shirtless while sunbathing, then why can't a girl? In the Tank Girl movie, she still sticks to her style and aesthetic, and she maintains her attitude and spunk. One critic described the movie as Mad Max by way of a Vivienne Westwood fashion show broken up with musical numbers and interspecies love affairs. I think there is some truth to this illustrative statement. The movie is even broken up by transitional comic panel scenes. Just as the comic was zine-like and had a multimedia look, so does the movie. It is interesting to look at the Tank Girl film in relation to other post-apocalyptic films. When analyzing movies like Mad Max, The Road, and I Am Legend, one critic begged the question, when it's the end of the world, do women get to do anything other than stand around and look pretty? Tank Girl differs from how women are typically portrayed. She is a leading woman who is entirely in on the action. She doesn't just stand back and let the men fight. She gets her hands dirty. Also, the Tank Girl movie passes the Bechdel test. For some background, Alison Bechdel created the test as a method for assessing gender bias in narratives. In order to pass the test, there has to be at least 2 women characters. They have to speak to each other, and they have to speak to each other about something other than a man. It is quite a low bar, and it doesn't even require that women are main characters, and yet more than 40% of all US films fail. Tank Girl not only pushes back against film industry norms, but specific scenes offer unique portrayals of the sexes. There is one scene specifically where we see male gaze slightly reversed. Tank Girl and her sidekick, Jet Girl, go undercover to hijack weapons. They convince these men who are handling the weapons that they are just there to photograph them for a sexy calendar. The men are flattered by this and try to pose themselves in what they believe to be alluring and attractive positions. Of course, the intention of this scene is more or less humor than sexiness, and the men are making a decision to be looked upon, but it still offers an interesting bend of traditional boundaries. After reviewing the comics and the movie, I believe that Tank Girl's post-apocalyptic world, her attitude, and her appearance lines up well with postmodern feminism. I do not say feminism because in her world, there does not seem to be a unified or defined movement to advocate for women's equality. I also do not say post-feminism because in her world, Tank Girl still deals with some level of misogyny. Not all components of the feminist movement seem to be achieved. I say postmodern feminism because it describes a type of feminism that is not of our modern world. In both the theory of postmodernism and feminism, there is a rejection of the status quo. In Tank Girl's world, you can see this. Postmodernism also represents a crisis of cultural authority. As I have said, Tank Girl was influenced by the counterculture of the time that she was created in, rather than the mainstream. One possible way to describe postmodernism is as a revolution, anarchist perhaps, against enlightened reason or the establishment, which has enabled us to hear the voices of the silent, gay, female, Black. I believe this definition fits in well with the history that we discussed, as well as the fact that Tank Girl, a female, is the main character controlling the story. Postmodern feminism specifically is a type of feminism that deals less with boundaries and binaries. Differences between men and women are described as socially constructed. In the Tank Girl comics and movie, there's definitely still acknowledgement of sex and gender, but there's flexibility between stereotypically masculine and feminine behaviors. Boundaries are significantly lessened in the comic and the movie than in our modern world. Lastly, we will be discussing how Tank Girl connects to us in the real world and why depictions of women in popular culture are so important. To kick off this last section, I want to show you something that really excited me during my research. This piece of art is part of a 2012 exhibit called Tank Girl. Look familiar? Throughout the web series and during this discussion, I have described our Tank Girl as militaristic. In stories, she strategizes with her army-like team in order to take down bad guys. She's constantly in on the action. She's depicted as strong and lethal, and she drives a tank. I'd imagine her silhouette would look similar to this, but this piece of art has no relation to the Tank Girl that we have been discussing. This piece was created by visual artist Nadine Hamen to challenge military rule and the patriarchy in Egypt. It is interesting to see how the symbol and idea of a girl in a tank could just show up somewhere else. Artist Hamen explained that her art piece invokes a formula of power inversion, in which women assumes control over one of the most masculine symbols of military power, the tank. In her artist statement, she says, "You can beat us, strip us, gas us, arrest us, virginity test us, but at the end we'll prevail." This was in response to the abuse women faced during protests. Her Tank Girl seemed to represent a revolution against oppressive forces. Nadine stated that if every woman joined together, they'd be able to make change. Just like art and galleries, popular culture can influence audiences and spread messages. Pop culture has the power of social commentary too. For example, pop culture like TV shows, magazines, and music give most people entertainment and information. Pop culture is also where women and men are offered the culture's dominant definitions of themselves. These dominant definitions may very well be poor stereotypes. In comics or movies, we see women defined as damsels in distress, evil stepmothers, or femme fatales. The list goes on. These tropes humanize stereotypes that women face, such as being weak or manipulative. When we look at Tank Girl compared to other comics and movies, we saw how she breaks stereotypes and bends boundaries in her postmodern world. Tank Girl was depicted in this way intentionally. I believe this statement relates well to Tank Girl's creation. Artists and producers have been able to work within the confines of commercial culture to produce material that challenges dominant ideologies. As we know, Tank Girl was created during the time of Thatcher in the UK. The dominant attitudes were conservative and traditional. Tank Girl offered a clear opposition to this. Tank Girl can be critical of current events, and she can speak her mind in a very candid way. Tank Girl is not traditional in both the social sense and in the world of comics. For example, when you first think of women in comics, Wonder Woman most likely comes to mind. She's a strong female lead, but she fulfills a very different need in our popular culture than Tank Girl. Yet, it should be noted that there are limitations to how much pop culture depictions of women can accomplish. Marjorie Ferguson coined the term feminist fallacy to describe the belief that representations of powerful women in media translate into cultural visibility and institutional empowerment for actual women. Comics don't directly make the institutional change that is needed to break glass ceilings. Actual women and society are necessary to make those more real-world changes. But I do believe in the power of figures like Tank Girl to show us a different point of view that can influence us to make a change or at least see things differently. Thank you so much for watching.